Good afternoon. My name is Brian Boyles. I'm Executive Director of Mass Humanities. So glad to have all of you here today for another episode of In Residence with my friend Joel Dinerstein. Joel, good to see you.
Good to see you, Brian. Nice to talk as close to face as many of us are getting these days. And I haven't seen you in 2 years anyway, so good to be here.
Good to see you. I want to give a few housekeeping notes and then introduce you and talk about the book. We will be taking questions, so you feel free to put your questions into the chat. We do ask that everybody but Joel and myself stay on mute in video and in audio, but we do encourage you as the conversation goes to please put questions into chat. You can follow us at Mass Humanities on Facebook and Twitter, and we do post videos of these conversations to our YouTube page, which we would love for you to share with your friends, because as I said, I think it's going to be this afternoon a very interesting conversation. So Joel is most recently the author of Jazz, A Quick Immersion. He's a cultural historian at Tulane University. And previous books include The Origins of Cool in Postwar America, American Cool, and Coach, A Story of New York Cool. He was the curator of the acclaimed exhibit American Cool in 2014 at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and he's also served as a consultant on jazz and popular music for many organizations, including our parent organization, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Cool is a big part of what he does and what he writes about, and he is a cool fellow. So Joel, really happy you're here. I want to get started talking about Quick Immersion in jazz, but I thought I would kick things off because the book, as you set it up, really is for people who have not found their way into this music. And so I think you really have a great thesis in that this is a cultural music that is overlooked, that is very much centered in rebellion, in a very American identity. And in doing that, you look at 5 different cities: Kansas City, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, and New Orleans. We're talking today from New Orleans, where before we got on the call today, we sort of thinking about how the entry points into jazz in New Orleans are somewhat more personal. But I wanted to start the conversation out by saying, maybe you could tell us a little bit about where jazz began for you, whether there was an artist or a piece of music that looking back, you feel like, that's when I got that music, that's when it hooked me, and that's why I've continued to have a life in jazz.
Yeah, I've been going to jazz clubs since the early 80s, I suppose. And when I got hooked is not actually where it starts. I mean, I sort of got hooked on Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane for separate reasons, maybe Lester Young. But I was in college at the University of Buffalo as an undergrad in the late 1970s. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. And the pop jazz of that period, which no longer really exists even as a concept, were people like Chuck Mangione, the trumpet player who had hits, and Spyro Gyra. And both those were Western New York. Chuck Mangione was from Rochester, Spyro Gyra was from Buffalo, and I went to see those gigs. And I also had those records, and I really liked them, even though I was like a rock and roller and all the rest of it. And I sort of liked what was a very rudimentary, well, not quite rudimentary, melodic sensibility and the interplay, and I wouldn't have had the vocabulary for it. But it was a real grounding for me. It was a gateway drug, right, into jazz. And but I know how to read music. My sister is a jazz pianist and runs a jazz program. My brother-in-law's a jazz pianist. But to some extent, I was already trying to figure out the roots of the music I loved. And first that was blues, and that sort of led me to jazz. And that's the confluence, is how do we get from blues to jazz, and how do I get from Spyro Gyra and Chuck Mangione to the real stuff? And so the real trigger, the inflection point, is that I'm sure you were like this, maybe. I mean, when you were younger, I just basically spent my days haunting used record stores, right, and trying to get deals. Hence what still remains of my record collection. And I was up at the one that was near my high school in Brooklyn called Titus Oaks, probably midway through college. And there was a Thelonious Monk record called Live at the 5 Spot. And it was $4. And I asked the guy who I trusted there, I said, what do you know about this? It's only like a great, wonderful name. I don't think I knew Monk maybe by name. And he said, oh yeah, that's great, you should buy it. And so I listened to Monk's, and if, as you know, Monk is changed how piano is played and heard. And so, of course, the first couple of run-throughs, it was quite disorienting. And so I kind of figured out jazz by figuring out how Monk's music works for me through continued listening. And that's one of the ways. That's the way my memory would shape it. And then Coltrane became a complete love, artist, worship, transformational artistic figure, probably a year or two later.
Huh. That's interesting. You know, similar experiences with Monk as being, I think, when I realized that I had hit the place that I wanted to really explore in the music. And in Monk, you know, speaking of gateway drugs, I mean, he's both foundational, but it spreads out from Monk so many. You're really, your ears are opened and ready for so many other types of music within jazz, I think, too. The book, which came out earlier this year, Jazz: A Quick Immersion, has been described by Ann Powers of NPR, I think, pretty well. It guides the reader by offering multiple views on jazz history, its relationship to cities, to Black migration, and to politics, its sonic evolution in streets, clubs, and concert halls, its many personalities, from legends like Louis Armstrong and Miles Davis to central but less famous figures like Ben Webster and Hamid Drake. And I think you and I have shared a few Hamid Drake concerts, and it's good to hear Hamid's name mentioned on NPR. It is, you know, a guide for the maybe uninitiated, but it also starts with, I think, a very important thesis, which that jazz hides in plain sight in global culture. And you look to these 5 cities to really trace the aspects of art and race and rebellion and freedom that, if you were new to the music, would give you a cultural context for it. I thought we would start with New Orleans, and there's a great quote in the section on New Orleans about why maybe I'm reading into this a little bit, but I think why popular culture or observers of music sometimes overlook New Orleans jazz, because we see it in a sort of sepia tone, and it has a quality that's maybe more friendly almost in some people's ears. But I think you aptly remind us that Sidney Bechet said his own grandparents had heard a new set of sounds when the Civil War ended, loud and as yet unformed, something they passed down to him as emancipation music. Can you talk a little bit about your understanding of New Orleans jazz, particularly evolving out of Jim Crow and out of the Reconstruction period? Because I think that's a really important place for us to position the music as a whole.
Well, that I will do that, but I will say that was a long question with many places that would have many answers, but I'll start at the end about New Orleans, because the beginning of that was the jazz hides in plain sight. And I start the book by talking about all the ways in which people actually know jazz, but not as jazz, that Motown's house band was all jazz musicians, that Earth, Wind & Fire was all jazz musicians, that Steely Dan was basically a jazz rock band, that Ray Charles is basically a soul jazz ensemble, stuff like that. And all the way to the present, going to Kamasi Washington, hip hop, et cetera. So my jazz hides in plain sight is really sort of an expansive understanding that jazz as a rhythmic foundation and as a set of practices, all of basically American popular music depends on it. And that includes country music, certainly Western swing and various things. But it's about New Orleans. So I grew up in Brooklyn, of course, and therefore my understanding of New Orleans came at first through the books that I'd read when I was understanding jazz history. And I, in fact, never visited here till I was about 34, which was weird because I did music tourism all the time. And so my understanding, and this is, you weren't reading anything into it, that most jazz history says that jazz starts in New Orleans, there's this big chapter in New Orleans, and then it leaves for various reasons, depending on the generation. And then there's never anything important about how New Orleans contributes to jazz after that. It goes to different places. You know, there are players, but that's not part of its development. And so this is a misreading that is shared by most jazz scholars, and most of the histories you'll read, because you won't understand why that's a misreading unless you live here. And the reason, Brian, you understand is because you lived here, which is to say that what constituted jazz when it was born, Buddy Bolden and Sidney Bechet, and not only the emancipation music, but the practices of soloing and all that came from jazz being a public music of the streets, of celebration music, of music for second line parades, of music for carnival celebrations. And second line parades, the ones that really are important, the weekly ones in African-American communities, are 150 years old. Louis Armstrong talks about them, Sidney Bechet talks about them, Danny Barker talks about them. And so the whole notion of being a public music of the streets is still true here and true nowhere else in America. So I needed to sort of, one of the reasons I took on the commission of the book was to correct this misinterpretation of New Orleans, which is that, no, jazz just is not what New Orleans think of it as New Orleans music. They didn't really think of it as jazz. And it's quite continuous. It is still a brass band music with a polyrhythmic foundation, both in drums and snares and cymbals and various percussion objects, that invents the solo. And once it leaves here, the jazz scholars are right. It never develops harmonically again, which is what jazz scholars are interested in. How does the music develop in its complexity? But every generation, it changes American music, whether it's funk or it's R&B or it's Fats Domino or whatever it is. And every generation, there are usually some musicians from New Orleans. Then you have periods like the 80s when everyone's from here. Wynton Marsalis, Donald Harrison, all those guys, Terrence Blanchard. And it's because New Orleans has a singular, distinctive, unique musical culture that no other American city has. It retains that at the street level. It goes all the way to the club level, and there just isn't anything like it. So most scholars aren't prepared to engage that because that's an uncommon, it's not an expectation that you'll find that. And so that's the reason why I wanted to write. It's like, that's why Jonathan Baptiste is the musical leader of the Colbert Show, because he comes out of what is not only a culture, but an entire aesthetic of we're gonna lift people's spirits and morales with this dynamic music. That's what we're gonna do. And that is what you learn if you're a musician here in the culture. And it doesn't really matter what race or ethnicity you are. If you're gonna be accepted, you're gonna learn how to do that. And so the crowds here learn how to do that regardless of where you're from, but that's what music is for. And so in New Orleans, music is less of a spectator consumption entertainment thing and more of an engaged, dynamic audience response, call and response thing. And that is because, as many people here say, it's the most African city in America. The African practices of music and rhythm that happened still get retained here from a long series of things, including Sidney Bechet's grandparents and Sidney Bechet himself. So that is understood. And I'll tell you a very short, funny story. During Katrina exile, by the way, I came back from what we used to call Katrina exile for a Hamid Drake show. That was my reason. It's like, well, that's as good a reason to come back as any. And I had been to see, I was in Austin, Texas, where I'd been to graduate school, and the Rebirth Brass Band played a gig at Stubbs Barbecue. And after 2 minutes, you could tell who in the audience was from New Orleans and they're in exile and who was local, because all the New Orleans people rushed to the stage and were throwing their hands up and singing and cheering and doing what you do with brass bands. And all the Austin audiences were standing back and looking at us like we were weird. And so I said, okay, well, here is further proof that this is actually how it works. So that would be my, I don't know, sort of short answer.
Well, I think you said a lot there that we could talk about, but I would say that experience you're talking about is really important in that something that always struck me was that New Orleans was one of the few places that I ever lived where people shouted during jazz performances. You know, that shouting encouragement. And when we think about gateway drugs, you know, I do think about beat literature as something that turned me on to the idea of jazz and even the behavior around jazz. And I can remember leaving New Orleans and coming north at a certain point and being, you know, at a concert and yelping the way that I do when great solos are played and realizing that I was very much a fish out of water. You know, I also wanted to say, you pointed to the reasons that jazz musicians continue to survive there and continue to influence music. And I think what's important about your book and also kind of the way you got to jazz is the way that music has influenced and continues to influence many other popular forms of music. When we think about New Orleans musicians, even if their passion was jazz, for economic reasons, they play in all kinds of other media, and so they don't see the divisions. And it's much more of an interdisciplinary art form, which maybe is lost sometimes when people write books or think about individuals or specialties.
Agreed. So the best way to think about this is that, so Fats Domino, one of course the founders of rock and roll, all of Fats Domino music is co-created by Dave Bartholomew, as you well know, passed away a year ago. And Dave Bartholomew did everything. He orchestrated, he created, he wrote most of the songs, he hired the band, he practiced them at Cosmo Matassa's studio. But the important thing is that Dave Bartholomew was a jazz musician. His trumpet teacher was Louis Armstrong's trumpet teacher. He's only 16, well, probably 20 years younger than Armstrong. And he ran a swing band. And so the way you can understand how rhythm and blues and rock and roll comes out of big band swing, which is one of the reasons that I know how to talk about this, is through Dave Bartholomew. He takes his swing era band, knocks it down to 7 pieces, co-writes something with more of a backbeat, gets a more dynamic, a kind of singer that changes the song structure, and we have rock and roll. And as you know, New Orleans has another claim to rock and roll through Cosmo Matassa's studio, et cetera. The reason I say that's how I understand it is my first book was a cultural history of big band swing, and Swing in the Machine, modernity, technology, and African American culture between the world wars. And that was my dissertation. And so I learned essentially how particularly African American musicians built American popular music step by step, from right after emancipation and how New Orleans participates, right up and through big band music. And so then I learned how it got deconstructed from big bands into small bands. And one of my favorite things is that the rhythm section of Cab Calloway's band, one of the biggest and most successful, Milt Hinton, the bassist, and Panama Francis, the drummer, were in fact the rhythm section on 12 of the earliest rock and roll hits, uncredited. Things like Splish Splash. And they said, guys didn't know how to set a rhythm, and that's what we did. So, so part of it, I had always intended to write a book called something like Swing to Rock. And now I won't, because in a way, this book is my Swing to Rock book. I just expanded it in both directions. I sort of got a little bit off the track for what your original question was. But, there it is. That is sort of how I understand it.
So I just want everyone listening to know this is a jazz conversation, and we are going to get off track and jump around, and that's totally okay in this platform. I'm going to jump around, and you mentioned some of your previous writings, and obviously cool and American cool has been a big part of your work, and I think with really great impact on people's understanding of that term. Can you talk about, you touch on this in this book as well, how the jazz performer becomes part of our idea of, I think you call, people who are seen as cool sort of cultural aristocrats in America, the replacements from stand-ins for royalty. How does someone like Miles Davis or Sonny Rollins, how do they end up embodying that to an American audience?
So obviously, so I've written a couple books about this. I'm going to have to work to make this a short, concise answer. Part of the way I got into it,
as long as it's swing.
Okay. Part of the answer to this is that I started researching cool when I was in graduate school, and I was stunned to learn when I was looking at jazz musicians, because I knew that jazz musicians were the first to use the term in its modern usage. And that's not what most of what I did. There wasn't much research on it at the time in the early 90s. But so I was just looking at jazz musicians. It's in their interviews. It's everywhere. And I got, one of the scholars said that, and more than one, said that Lester Young, the tenor saxophonist, was the first person to use the term. And so I didn't even imagine I was going to find such a ubiquitous term, that there was a beginning, never mind that you could say one person was responsible for it. And it wasn't exactly factually true, but it's not exactly false. Lester Young is responsible individually for the dissemination of the modern usage of cool. So it meant certain things for jazz musicians of the time. It was a vernacular African-American term in the 1930s. They didn't invent it, Lester didn't invent it. But it came to mean what exactly chill means now. It meant to be chill, to be relaxed and safe and comfortable in the environment, and then in the performance environment. So it became, if you on stage can seem as if you are relaxed and that your artistic effort is no sweat, is literally cannot be seen, right? So you excite audiences by yourself remaining chill and relaxed. That was the early cool aesthetic that Lester Young developed, and that became part of Miles Davis's kind of iconic, not only birth of the cool, but that's what Miles was known for. He would like be on stage as if he was gonna half asleep, play a beautiful solo, and then turn his back on the audience or walk away. So the whole notion of catering to an audience or performing, or at the time, the stereotype of African-American performers, you know, sweating or working hard or showing their passion or protest, cool was the opposite of that. And it was a kind of withdrawal, and it was in fact a stylistic defiance against racism and stereotypes. It was about not being defined, so you had to take your performance kind of out of the act. It sounds paradoxical, but that's what you do. You take the expectations out, and all you leave in is the art. And if you come for the art, then you come for the art. If you're coming for some sort of racial projection of, you know, sort of rhythm and excitement and uplift from a very privileged white point of view, those musicians would rather you didn't come. And so that's a lot of, you know, the real complexity around it, that it's an actual new term, that it's an actual aesthetic, that it actually has a cultural resistance sort of matrix about it. And then of course it becomes highly influential. So I think of it as a space of rebellion led by jazz musicians before the civil rights movement. So in the decade from 1945 to 1955, when the Montgomery bus boycott and Martin Luther King get going, there's no space for political rebellion for African Americans. And so jazz musicians kind of lead it. And there's a scholar named Bed Sindrin, who's a musician, who once called that period the period of the Black Underground among jazz musicians. And I just find that a useful term. I don't use it very often because it can be, you know, applied to different things. But his was the first book I read called Black Talk that made that point.
And then it does surface, and it becomes much more a music that does have more expression when it comes to Black identity and political liberation movements. Can you talk us through a little bit about some of the figures who helped transition that? And, you know, looking at the cities by cities, I think about even the Art Ensemble of Chicago being a phase in that, right? But when does that start to really come to a place where if you're attending a certain jazz performer's performance, you're seeing that this is a political statement and not just one of restraint?
Yeah, to some extent, cool goes from being sort of covert, subtle rebellion to being overt, you know, sort of protest. And within music, way before we get to the art ensemble, Sonny Rollins does that. I mean, in terms of before it becomes overt, there are all these compositions with cool in the title in the 1940s and early 50s, and it doesn't exist before that. Charlie Parker's Cool Blues and Sonny Clark's Cool Struttin', there's just many of them. But after that, you get less of the word, because the word had a sort of set of meanings, into the practice. And so a lot of the jazz musicians go to Africa and bring back African rhythms and start doing a cultural heritage and building that into jazz, from Art Blakey to Sonny Rollins to many other musicians. And some of them make statements politically on their records. Sonny Rollins' Freedom Suite being one of them, in which the musicians start saying, look, we're playing music that people think of as very American music. And we do not have freedom in this country, nor do we have any recognition as artists, which actually was not really true of jazz musicians yet. And so those kind of statements start happening and become part of the music. Famously, Charles Mingus makes a statement about the civil rights movement against Governor Faubus called Fables of Faubus. So there are these major statements about civil rights and that are anti-racist in the music itself in the late 1950s. You get more in the early 60s. And then a lot of it becomes focused around John Coltrane, who becomes, particularly with A Love Supreme, but even before that, the figure who is treated as a prophet and a mystic and something of an avatar of artistry, freedom, and protest. And the best way for anybody listening actually to access that is to listen to his song Alabama, which is a ballad. It's actually a dirge about the killing of the 4 girls in Selma, Alabama, in 1963. But it's a song in which it's a dirge in which, I describe this in the book, in which the third time he tries to play the theme, he breaks the melodic line, and it really sounds like his heart is breaking. And so I think to some extent, what you're getting in that period is, and the reason for cool being embodied in the jazz musician, sorry, I lost you there for a second, is because this is the period of civil rights protest. And one of the few periods, and now maybe another one, in which the rest of America, particularly white America, is being awakened, I won't use woke, is being awakened to the inequality of America. And the jazz musician plays a very special role as the artist figure who is publicly on stage nightly that you can go see, embodying both the protest and the humanity of an artist who is not, you're not watching him suffer, you're watching him or her turn their experience into art. And it's the only art form where you do that, actually, nightly on stage. You know, jazz brings in the whole concept of improvisation to art in the 20th century, and that's what you're doing. You're improvising yourself in relation to your environment every night. And so this becomes sort of, you know, the kind of leading edge of how you can get art and politics and aesthetics and emergence kind of all together. I mean, by the time, to get back, I forgot, by the time you get to the art ensemble in the late 1960s, the art ensemble of Chicago, you have an ensemble that is dedicated to expanding your ideas of music, your sonic palette, your ideas of African Americans as individuals and as artists, and just disoriented whatever you might think of as music, concert, theater, Africa, Black America, etc.
Is there an irony, though, that as the music gets more challenging that way, that the audience shrinks to some degree? You know, that as they really do start to push the boundaries of what we think about jazz suddenly becomes seen as even more difficult. And I think some of that is the legacy we're still living with, probably, that you're addressing.
No, absolutely. And to some extent, this is why I wrote the book. It's like the problem with most intro to jazz, and a lot of them are very, very good books, is that they start out by saying that here's what jazz is, and here's what it does, and here's how you'll have to learn. It basically tells you early on this is going to be work. Now, most people do not want to hear that music they're going to listen to and maybe love is going to be work. And so I said, all right, jazz is wonderful, is beautiful, profound music. You don't need to know much. And so in my introduction, I said, look, I've known a lot of people, colleagues, et cetera, who have said, I don't know how to listen to jazz. And so I've thought about this question many times. And I said, all right, so start with, there are 2 things to listen for. Listen to the soloist only when he or she is playing, and listen to and find the groove and get into it. And you can do one or the other. And for me, I was always very groove oriented. So listen to the groove. And then later, when you're comfortable in it, listen to the soloist. Or the other way around, listen to the soloist, just find wherever he or she is going with the musical, with the line he or she is playing, and then see how it works with the rest of the band. Because, and so soloist and groove. And then the thing that I was most surprised by as a scholar was learning that the dominant metaphor for jazz musicians is that they're having a conversation. Like when asked, what is jazz? There's a whole ethnography that says, well, when we're playing, we're having a conversation. So they're having a nonverbal conversation. And once you know that, that changes how you can listen once you get to the next step, especially live. Like this is really obvious live. If you go and you know they're having, and you watch the musicians and you watch how they respond to each other, this is really obvious. But if you don't know it, you don't know that. So I wanted to give people, all right, here's a quick couple of things about how to listen. And then of course I stay away for the most part from a lot of the difficult, you know, disorienting or unpleasant, to some people dissonant aspects of jazz. I mean, I include them, I talk about them, but I also know that's not the entry for most people if you want to get them to like jazz. Like, fine, I want you to get to that, but if you listen your whole life to Bill Evans and John Coltrane, I'm happy. I'm not, you know, I'm not here to change your mind about it. I mean, I guess I am a little bit, but really I'm just trying to get you interested enough that you will understand that this is probably the greatest American art created in this country. And it should be part of any program in public education to teach people that it is and why it's American and how you can listen to history and beauty through it, et cetera, et cetera. So just to give you an example, one of the most difficult, not quite difficult, I have a number of playlists at the back based on themes, the blues, the groove, et cetera. And there's one just called Jazz Beauty. And most of those are lyrical and really easy to get into. But I had a couple of more dissonant, more rougher compositions on there. And the roughest one is called The Terrible Beauty. And it's by a band called Harriet Tubman. So if you want sort of an entry thing on American history, this is a contemporary band. It's run by bassist Melvin Gibbs, who I went to junior high school with, which is why I know the band. And it's their version of Redemption Song, actually. And it has a certain kind of brutal beauty. Like, it sounds like somebody swung guitars into a transformer and tried to make music out of it. But if you can sort of, it has that form of like searing guitar solo as if it was orchestrated. But I only do that once or twice. Like, you wanna, open your ears, here's one of those. If you don't, it's all right, you don't have to.
There were efforts by musicians to do somewhat of the same thing, though, as far as making it easier or building bridges. You touch on CTI, which I always think is a very interesting thing to consider, though I'm not always that interested in listening to it. But this is in your section on Los Angeles. Can you talk a little bit about that movement and that label and that band? Because I think that that's an interesting thing to consider when we talk about the ways people get into jazz and the ways that jazz has tried to fight to have some audience throughout these different changes.
Right. Well, CTI was a label founded out in California and for a sort of California sound. So it's in the Los Angeles chapter. But the guy who founded it was actually this guy, Creed Taylor, who also founded Impulse Records, which was the most outside, dissonant, protest-oriented jazz in history, with Archie Shepp and Albert Ayler and people like that. But he saw that jazz had lost its audience to a certain extent, and he thought he would meet the audience halfway. And this is at the top of the interview when I talked about the pop jazz of the 1970s. In effect, a lot of that came out of CTI. They had hits with popular songs. So the guitarist George Benson first crossed over with Masquerade and songs like that. Even before that, he was a virtuosic jazz guitar player. He also had a hit with California Dreamin'. And Deodato, the Brazilian percussionist, had a hit with the 2001: A Space Odyssey theme. And so so on the one hand, some people don't like CTI because they think smooth jazz is a term of derision. But on the other hand, they recorded a lot of great records. But what they did was they made lush productions, so the records are sonically perfect. They brought in Brazilian and funk rhythms, but kept them at a light level, which is why it's sometimes talked about with disdain. But they had the greatest musicians. Their session band was Miles Davis's band. It was like Herbie Hancock and Ron Carter and those guys. So the people in the 60s and early 70s who were in a much more protest-oriented space thought of this music with a certain amount of disdain, and so did their audience. But it brought back people to jazz in a way that I think a lot of people didn't think of it as jazz. But, that music had its, so besides, in a sense, having the hits, all of the moves of 70s music were in CTI, the use of the Fender Rhodes and the electric piano. Jazz fusion, which is my least favorite genre. A lot of people like it. I'm not afraid to say that. But the electric piano and the Fender Rhodes was one sound of the 70s, even if you didn't like a sort of all electric, all electronic jazz band. It had Brazilian rhythms, which were key to a 1970 sound. It had funk rhythms. It had, these, and it had the polished production. What is interesting about it, and I say this in the book, in terms of having the last laugh, because it was understood at the time that it wasn't like real jazz, is that all kinds of neo soul and hip hop artists often sample CTI grooves, Erykah Badu and Snoop Dogg and all kinds of people. And it doesn't really matter whether the tune is by, you know, the white keyboard player, Bob Stewart, or by Grover Washington, whomever. So they have found it useful to rap over and to create rhythm tracks for by sort of, you know, paying their respects to this period that seemed like it was kind of diluting real jazz. So again, one of the positions of my book is not to make those kinds of judgments, is just to do a history of its development, to note where something new was happening, and then, you know, take it to the present when I could, which is why the Chicago chapter has a section on the last 20 years, which is a major scene, and Los Angeles chapter ends with Kamasi Washington and the scene he comes out of. So I found the city structure both useful because it's historically true in a linear way, and that all of these cities, except Kansas City, are the ones that retain jazz scenes, even today.
Following CTI and following, I think, the more post-Coltrane music, there's a reaction that's launched a lot in New York, but from a particular New Orleanian, Wynton Marsalis, as well as Stanley Crouch, the critic, who has recently passed away, that, you know, ends up being called sort of the Young Lions movement, which is, again, I think, a response to dying audiences, and actually ends up benefiting a lot of the original bebop players because album sales come back up. But it seems the further we get from that, sort of a problematic statement in some ways, because on the one hand, it was really trying to get back to some roots, and the other hand, it had some statement around what Black cultural expression should be. You don't touch a whole lot on that movement in there, but when I think about people, again, approaching the music, you know, there is a sort of renaissance in the late 80s and 90s because of people like the Marsalis brothers or Terrence Blanchard, where we're seeing that. How does that look now to you, you know, 15, 20 years later, particularly through the lens that you're putting forth for new users?
Well, so I always stayed out of that argument for a lot of reasons. And partly it's because certainly my first book is about big band swing. And so part of what the Wynton Marsalis wing was doing, which was taking off from the great critic Albert Murray's, who was also Stanley Crouch's kind of figure of a mentor, was that nobody, I mean, in the 80s, the whole era of the big bands had disappeared. It wasn't part of public memory. It wasn't part of the music you listened to as you got older in your 20s. And so they established an actual classical repertoire of early jazz, particularly big band, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, et cetera. And so I thought that was important, that aspect of it. So I didn't really want to argue about that. And the Lincoln Jazz Orchestra was a great orchestra. It's like if people are going to come and see America's classical music, as it is called, they should be able to see it in Lincoln Center for, you know, at a healthy price point to pay musicians and see a great band. And of course, Herlin Riley, the New Orleans drummer, was in that band. A lot of New Orleans musicians were in that band. So the part I was against, and I still think doesn't look great, is Wynton Marsalis's, in particular, and some of the what was called neoclassical musicians rebelling against jazz and the avant-garde, as saying that, as you say, this is what a Black cultural expression should be, or this is what is the highest form of it. And whenever you take that stand in any art form, the musicians are going to get mad, and they're also going to say this limits the art form. Well, how are young players going to expand or change how this works if you think there is a particular way to play, right? So I was against that part of it, and for the part of it that produced that moment, and as you say, brought back album sales, but brought back a national attention and even a global attention to jazz as an art form. And I thought that would have possibly faded without it. So to some extent, I don't have a problem with that. What that movement looks like to me was whenever you have a roots movement in a musical form, some people say we've lost this and we need to pay attention to it. And I think that's true. And depending on adamant they are, you know, the other group thinks that they're trying to stop progression. Now, I won't go into this, but I do actually have a sort of what would be called a conservative position about avant-garde art in general, not just in jazz, and what your expectations should be of it, and how hard it is to drag people into loving the avant-garde. And so I would think that artists should recognize that in any sphere. My experience with avant-garde artists in many spheres is they don't. And so, but that's a different story for a different day. But that's how I see that movement. And it's also, it also redirected a little bit attention back to New Orleans as the beginnings of jazz. One of the things I found fascinating in the 80s in New York, when I was going to jazz clubs all the time, was that I would meet people who would say, I want to go to New Orleans and see jazz. And I would go, what are you talking about? New York is the center of the jazz world. I mean, it always has been and was then more than ever, except maybe in the 50s. And so I love that New Orleans has retained that aura, that people think this is where you'll see real jazz. I'm very happy for that, particularly now that I've lived here for 20 years. But in terms of where the best players are globally and where they go to get their game and up it and play with the masters in the field, they're in New York. They still are. So that also gives me a sort of privileged perspective, since, you know, I come to New Orleans from the outside. I grew up in New York in what was the fairly heady 1980s, when I saw like the World Saxophone Quartet and people like that in the clubs and stuff like that. But so it gives me an advantage in a way to write a book like this, because I don't have to take sides.
I think that's healthy. I want to remind people that you can drop questions into the chat. We have a few here that I'm going to put forth that I did want to ask, and I think that's in line with what we're talking about in a lot of ways. Your university, Tulane University, recently renamed its jazz studies program Black American Music program. And Black American music is a term that, you know, really I think has been popularized most recently by Nicholas Payton, the trumpet player who sort of veered off from that movement of classicism into his own form. Can you talk about what that means to you when you think about students or when you think about scholarship, that name has changed and what message it sends?
All right, this is a fascinating question. I mean, I'm not trying to, you know, to mark time. So as you say, Nicholas Payton has been arguing this for a while. This has a very long history. So most jazz musicians, particularly African-American ones, have never liked the term jazz. Never thought it was accurate, never thought it was one that came from their community, never really liked it. And so someone, and not me, should write an article about the deep history of this. So New Orleans musicians used to mostly call jazz ragtime. Sidney Bechet called it ragtime, not because he didn't like the term, he didn't think it meant anything musically. But more importantly, Duke Ellington used to call it Negro music. And when Dizzy Gillespie developed bebop, Duke Ellington said to him, you know, you should never have given it a name. He goes, you should have just called it Negro music, because then if anybody who wasn't an African-American wanted to play it, they would have to admit this is Black music, which is going to be the question for the students at Tulane, right? You don't have to be African-American to play it. You just have to recognize that these are the creators and this is the form. And I think because of America's fraught racial issues, that is going to be very difficult for students, and it's going to cause a certain amount of tensions. I think they are completely right on the merits to do so. I do think, I cannot predict how it's going to work for students who want to study it, and whether it makes a difference if you want to study jazz versus studying Black American music. But I do think it's accurate and it's important, and it's a necessary thing to do, whatever debates we're going to have about it, right? So I'll give you my example why. I was talking, when I did a Zoom event about this book, I was talking to Melissa Weber, who is the curator of the Hogan Jazz Archive and is also a longtime nationally renowned DJ of soul, DJ Soul Sister. And so her understanding of African-American music is both deep and wide and dense. And I'm a generation older than her, actually probably more than that. And we were talking about this issue, but and I said, it used to frustrate the hell out of me because I was a rock critic even before, you know, as an amateur, before I studied this. And it seemed very difficult for professional or commercial applications to call things African-American music. That's why you need these genre names that sort of evade whose music it was and who creators were. So in the 90s, in the 80s, and I don't know if you remember this, in the 90s, there was a period in which there was a format on the radio called jams, Jams. And jams were basically R&B, soul, and disco jams, and they were 95% African-American. And but they didn't want to call it urban music, which itself is an evasion and a euphemism, right? So the transitional thing was jams, and it became pretty popular pretty quickly, and I don't know how it disappeared, but I remember the first time I saw it in more than one market, or I heard it, I thought, how are you not calling this Black music? Like, what kind of nerve do you have that you're just calling this jams so that people don't have to deal with that? And so I see this, I see this all, as you ask it, as an article to write, that again, I don't want to write in a scholarly way, although knowing me, now that I've had the idea, I might, but that it is it's not just, it is something that needs to be brought to the attention of anybody who's interested in the music and its history as a long-term response by African-American musicians to the term jazz, which has never been enjoyed or loved.
I hope you write that article. Good question here, and I think very much in line with what we're talking about, from Ruth Griggs, who asks, do you have a chapter on the unique role and contributions of women in jazz? And your book is organized by cities, but can you talk about the contributions of women in jazz, especially, I think, in each of these movements, but in recent years, I think we've seen a lot more prominence and recognition of certain women performers, but where does that story fit in here?
So I don't have a chapter on women in jazz, and I do include the women in each city who are prominent, like Mary Lou Williams in Kansas City and in New York, for example. And I do, and because I was doing it in terms of a historical development, and because it's a short book, I mean, you can read it in 3 hours, and therefore I made a point of privileging narrative through lines that were easy to follow and major figures. I realized that there was a cost to that, and one of the costs was being able to isolate or talk about women in jazz as an example. So my compensation for that was that, so there are 5 major chapters on these 5 cities, and then there are 5 short chapters that are basically annotated playlists around certain themes. And so I made sure that women are prominent in all of those, that Esperanza Spalding and Carla Bley and all kinds of major figures that don't quite fit into my narratives of cities and development appear. And of course I put them, in the places that they belong in each of those cities, but jazz was, particularly in its first half century, very heavily male in terms of the major players, literally and figuratively, in terms of who did the developing. And so that's just, that's just, sense. If you want that, there are many books that do that, and I can point you to any of them. But my book could not really totally do that, except in as much as when those women were completely central. Louis Armstrong's first wife within the Hot 5 and the Hot 7s is central to the development of New Orleans music in Chicago. Mary Williams, of course. More recently, Cassandra Wilson gets a couple of paragraphs, and Esperanza Spalding, etc. But I did the best I could to make that work without making it a separate chapter.
I've been on a heavy dosage of Nina Simone over the last couple of months, especially given the political climate that we're in right now. And that, I think, brings me to maybe my last question is, people always want to know what's going on right now. But I think in your book, you do a good job of showing the different strands. Who are you listening to right now that's alive and well and performing that you feel like is a good place for people, maybe not to start, but just to feel, I think, that continuum around this musical revolution that does hit on liberation, that does actually have a larger context? Well,
the one artist that I would say, and I can recommend to everybody, is Charles Lloyd, 2 L's, the tenor saxophonist, who probably has the best body of work in the last 20 years of any jazz musician. And he's 80. And his life is amazing. Like, this is the reason to write this book and keep the narrative through lines. And I don't mention Charles Lloyd in the book, despite the fact that I could have. But Charles Lloyd grew up in Memphis in the 40s and 50s and was friends and played with all the people who produced the records on Stax in Memphis and the Al Green records. He was good friends with Phineas Newborn, who's a little known virtuoso pianist from that period. So he comes up in the South in Memphis in an incredibly musically fertile period, and then goes away, takes up Eastern religion, returns, makes this classic record in 1966, more than 50 years ago. And Keith Jarrett's on it, the pianist, Jackie Jeanette, the drummer's on it. It's like their earliest, it's not their earliest recording, but it's very early. It's called, I think, Forest Flower. Sometimes I mistake it, but I think it's called Forest Flower. And then he, plays, he has a wonderful lyrical sound. It's many ballads, so like it's a really easy access point. He has a lyrical sound. Some of the albums are stunningly beautiful, just the actual ballads. In the last 20 years, he always hired the best, newest musicians. So he also has the best young pianists. He has Jason Moran and a couple others. And so the bands are tight and great. And of course, he explores things. But he has a new record that's a double record, which is kind of like celebrating being 80. And the tracks are amazing. It's called Kindred Spirits. And so he's a great place to start. And I do listen to him all the time. I think the most important movement of the two most important movements in the 21st century of jazz, first is Latin jazz. In the last 20 years, the ways in which jazz has been taken up by musicians in South America, Central America, etc., has basically made all Latin rhythms fundamental to any professional jazz playing. You can no longer play anymore if you cannot play within a clave beat or various Latin American rhythms. And I think a lot of the Latin American jazz of the past 20 years is great. Before this century, mostly it was the Cuban musicians who were at the head of that. And now they're from Puerto Rico, they're from Mexico. The Brazilian jazz has always been one particularly province of jazz, whether bossa nova or Alberto Gismonti. And I recommend to anybody getting started that Brazilian jazz is a great place to start. It's very user-friendly. The rhythms are very accessible. And of course, bossa nova, which comes up in the late 50s, is immediately seized upon by jazz musicians who love it. And so in the early 60s, all these musicians, Stan Getz, Ike Quebec, Charlie Bird, make jazz bossa nova and jazz samba records. And those are all great gateway drugs to jazz. The third most important, besides Latin jazz, is just that jazz is probably the most global music in the world. And when I say global, I mean musicians from all over the world take the fundamentals of jazz, make it their own, and then make their own cultural expression. Play something that you can hear as Brazilian jazz, that you can hear as Japanese jazz, et cetera, et cetera. And so to that extent, my last playlist in the book is all international. And jazz has become hugely popular to play in China and Japan and Korea. And in fact, I would say a half dozen of the best young jazz pianists are Chinese and Korean women, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean women. And so to that extent, that is also one of the reasons why much of the true transformation of jazz by women is contemporary. And my book couldn't quite get to it and still keep its structure of its cities and its history.
So when we started this conversation, we talked about how shopping in used record stores was a big experience in getting started. I own a copy of Charles Lloyd in the Soviet Union.
Nice.
That I purchased, I believe, on the Lower East Side sometime in 2001, 2002. So I was glad you brought that up. This has been, as always, when we get together, a great conversation, and I would love to continue it. I think that we have many people on here today who have asked about ways that they can stay up with you and learn more about your work. I'm glad that we also have put into the chat Garden District Books in New Orleans, which is a great place to order Joel's book, Jazz, A Quick Immersion, as well as his other books. Anything else, Joel, you want to add about ways that people can continue to follow, I think, your work and your scholarship?
Yeah, so on a logistical level, I will say that one of the reasons I took on this book was because of Spotify, because streaming changes everything. Books like mine used to come with a CD, and it would say, go to track number 3, and 1 minute and 2, you'll hear this solo. And now you can just go to Spotify or YouTube and pull up the song and go to 1 minute and 2, and it's really easy. And I've been very gratified to hear that people who are reading it, as well as my friends, are going through the playlist as they read the chapter and just for pleasure. So those are printed in the book, the Spotify playlist, screenshots are printed in the book. But I would also say that if you follow me on Spotify, and I can, I'll send this to you and you can put this in, and it's just, you can probably find me with my name, Joel Dinerstein, but if not, my username is JDPrez, JDPREZ. And if you follow me, my first public playlists are the playlists from the book. So you don't even, even if you're not going to buy the book, and I still want you to love jazz, the playlists are listed by city, and then they're listed by theme, like blues and groove. And if you go to public playlist, that tab, it says QIJ, which is Quick Immersion Jazz, and those are the first 12 playlists. So that's one way to do it too.
Great, great. Thank you for putting those playlists together. And thank you for writing this book. Thank you for being here today to talk to us. I really appreciate it. It was really good seeing you, Joel.
Thanks, Brian. This has been really fun. Very good to see you. I hope we can talk soon. Kick it around, you and me. Other people, I'm easy to find on the web in general or email in case you have follow-up questions.
Awesome. We will be back. We're taking a brief break in residence because we have the Governor's Awards in the Humanities on October 25th. If you go to masshumanities.org, you can learn more about that and joining us. And then we'll be back on November 11th with Rhonda Anderson of the Ocotea Cultural Center, a new cultural center of Native American work that's being done in Ashfield in conjunction with Double Edge Theater. That's November 11th. We'll be sure to send you all links to this video at YouTube Mass Humanities, as well as information on Joel's book and ways you can tune in to more of these conversations. Thanks everybody for supporting the humanities in Massachusetts today. Be well.